yourself?
All right, good afternoon. It's usually tough talking before lunch when you do a field day event, but this is actually during lunch. So if you did bring some food, I have no problem. That's got to be a tough gig. You had spring break last week. University of Florida's on spring break this week. But most of us that grew up in the north, we come down the third and fourth week in March because that's just the time that we always did. So we invaded the great state of Florida. But I am Jerry Fankhauser. You can see the screen. I'm Assistant Director of the Florida Agricultural Experiment Station. That is an old terminology, but what it basically is the research arm of the land-grant institution. So the University of Florida is a land-grant institution. You're a state institution, but we have three missions at the University of Florida. Of course, academics, extension for our growers like Chuck Oberg and the many other growers across the state of Florida, and then research. So I support the research enterprise both on campus and off. About 50% of my effort is off campus. And the way traffic is in Gainesville, I love being off campus. So especially this time of the year with the whole snowbird effect too, and the traffic on I-75. I have a condo in Bradenton, so I got to see my daughter last night. And a short drive down here, hour and a half, hour and 40 minutes. So I know Dr. Roca through his work at Southwest Florida Research and Education Center. He's probably talked about that in the past. That's one of our 12 research and education centers within IFAS. Everyone know what IFAS is, that acronym? Institute of Food and Agricultural Sciences. Most every other land-grant institution, and there's one in every state, calls their IFAS a College of Agriculture. So University of Minnesota, Purdue University, NC State. My boss is the Dean of Research, Dr. Rob Gilbert. Excellent director and Dean of Research at the University of Florida with that institute. He spent many years at the Belglade Research Center, which we call the Everglades. So on that muck soil, if you've never seen muck, it's truly unique. Sugarcane production, rice production, specialty crops like lettuce. He then came up to Gainesville about 7, 8 years ago to be an academic chair like your department here, agribusiness, and now is the Dean of Research. You may have heard of Dr. Zach Grimm. I don't know what materials you've gotten, but he's down at Homestead. He's our lead scientist for our hemp research and education program. And so Dr. Grimm and myself, we work very closely. And why am I involved in hemp? Well, it's pretty simple. I was told to do it. So I have one of those jobs as duties as described. And those are great jobs because you can do a lot of different things. So I became the lead oversight manager because back in 2017, the state of Florida, essentially the legislators gave in, right? And enacted statute which allowed for hemp research and extension efforts in the state of Florida. So that's my other kind of official title, and it's been a wild ride since 2017. I'm going to kind of talk about that. Why is it always like that? I'm going to get to that point. Let me give you a bit of background because I do have gray hair and you're maybe wondering who I am. And I want to make this very interactive. If you have questions, I've worked with peppermint, spearmint, apple production, corn and soybean, obviously coming from Indiana. So don't be afraid to ask questions that you're thinking about. But I did grow up with a snowmobile and now I have a jet ski. So I've had an interesting life, you know, transitioning. I grew up near Lake Michigan. My family still farms where you see that PPAC up towards the Great Lake there. But I am a former director of the Purdue Ag Center system. So that's our outlying research center system for Purdue University across the state. 8 farms, 5 of those were gifted by families. It shows you the family farm culture that you see in Florida and you also see in many states like Indiana. When I got my master's degree at Purdue in 1987, I immediately applied for and got one of the outlying center position. Funny story there, I just got married too, and I married a woman that I'm still married to 36 years later, but she grew up near Chicago, an hour from where I grew up, but in an urban environment. Her dream was to graduate from Purdue and see the world. And what she did, she married me, she graduated from Purdue and ended up in an old farmhouse, a research center. So that didn't sit well. So I stayed there 7 years and then went to industry to be a tech service rep for American Scientific crop protection products. Some people call them chemicals. Corn, soybean, specialty crops. That company was sold, a lot of consolidation in the industry, but I enjoyed my time in Northern Ohio, but I'll never be an Ohio State Buckeye fan, I can tell you that. It was a fun 2 years. I was recruited back to Purdue to start a consolidated research center at Throckmorton Purdue Ag Center in 1997. Geez, I finally had a decent cell phone by then. When I started in the business of agricultural research, we used to do weekly updates by hand and mail them every Friday. So can you imagine my experience? I was, about your age on, having to do weekly updates and mail them by Friday so my supervisor would get them on Monday on campus. Now, information is instantaneous, and it's just amazing how we've advanced, not only in agriculture, but most industries. So I'm supposed to talk to you about hemp. Hemp is a truly unique crop. I actually grew up with hemp because I grew up in the shadows of Lake Michigan there. But back 100 years ago, farmers grew hemp. It was legal. They used it for rope. World War I, we had a lot of hemp rope. It's truly a tough fiber that has a lot of uses. The problem with hemp, cannabis sativa, is it can be moderately invasive. And so we had a problem in our ditches in northern Indiana, because like South Florida, we drain some agricultural lands, and we had this weed called ditchweed. Have you ever heard of ditchweed? It's basically wild hemp, cannabis. And so the city kids would try to get hemp to smoke it and get a headache. But we tried to kill it because it would slowly creep in the fields. So ditchweed can be found in Kansas, Indiana, Illinois. And so we knew that farmers 100 years ago were growing hemp. And it is a crop with many uses, and had good uses back in the day. So in 2014, has any of this been explained to you on the history of hemp legalization? The 2014 Farm Bill, so I don't want to reinvent the wheel here. That was transcending. It was beneficial for certain states, and I can tell you who they were: Kentucky, Tennessee, NC, North Carolina, and NC State. They're a land grant institution. They immediately jumped on that legislation. And that was basically a research permitting type legislation. It didn't declare that hemp was an agricultural commodity. It was basically a compromise that Senator Mitch McConnell and others were able to work out to get hemp in growers' fields to take a look at this crop. Tobacco had become less of an important crop in the country, and hopefully none of you all are smoking, although I shouldn't render any opinions. But the funny thing is, when I grew up, we used to have family get-togethers, and you talk about secondhand smoke. There would be family parties where we couldn't see across the living room because every family member, adult in my family, smoked in the late 1960s. And when I interviewed for my first job, my supervisor was smoking a pipe in the office. And how far we've come just in those years. But that change in the use of tobacco in the United States changed agriculture in Tennessee and Kentucky, southern Indiana, North Carolina. So growers were looking for alternative crops, and knowing that hemp can grow and thrive in certain regions of the country, there was a lot of political pressure to get some legislation in that 2014 Farm Bill. States like Indiana, and I was involved in the Indiana hemp program when I was still at Purdue University, part of my 27-year career there. But there were some lobbyists, there were some advocates, including past Commissioner of Agriculture, Nikki Freedy, that advocated for hemp legislation. And finally in 2017, Florida legislators allowed, not Florida Gulf Coast, only the University of Florida and Florida A&M, the opportunity to take a look at hemp. And so we basically were facing a number of hurdles to get hemp established in a research environment up and down the state of Florida. That's our mandate. We're the land grant institution. That was the expectation from legislators, from growers like Chuck Oburn and others, and we felt like we delivered. But it wasn't easy. One of the first steps is we had to visit with DEA agents. And I don't know if you've ever sat down with a federal agent. They're not really social. They didn't even want to be there, but they had to certify our seed storage. And because seed is what they're concerned about. They're actually not that concerned about plants. But they don't like seed moving across the borders of the United States if they don't know it's low THC cannabis. And everyone knows what the definition of hemp is, right? Anything below 0.3%, I throw away. Okay. So it was a real challenge. This statute that was approved in 2017 said we had 2 years to do good science and to get that information out to growers and others. And we also had to put a project report together specifically delivered to the leader of the House and Senate, Tallahassee, and actually Governor DeSantis. So that was strange legislation. And I wrote that report along with Dr. Brim. I sent it to Governor DeSantis and didn't get acknowledgement, but I think, one of his staff members probably read that report. And that report is online, and I'll show that later. The initial approval from our Board of Trustees, and if our Board of Trustees are like Florida Gulf Coast, they're a mix of people, very successful, a little bit conservative. And they had to grit their teeth to approve what some of them believe is a devil's lettuce. Have you ever heard of that, Hemp? This was transcending for the university, which essentially didn't allow marijuana research, to let IFAS work with low THC cannabis. But they did approve it, limited to only our facilities. We cannot do breeding efforts, and I'll never totally understand that aspect. I think that was a compromise. And everything we grew, we were going to crop destruct. When I say crop destruct, it was not going to enter the commercial channel of trade. After a year or so, we went back to the Board of Trustees. They noticed that none of us went to jail the first year. And we had growers like Chuck Ober, and it eventually became one of our qualified project partners that also wanted to grow hemp. And we got additional approvals. You can go ahead, advance it. So I wanted to show this slide because this is the overview. We worked with DEA, the federal agents, to get a Schedule I registration that we maintain. And I carry that in my pickup truck in case I'm ever T-bone, and I'm carrying plants and seed, because you can forget some other permits, but if you have that Schedule I registration in your truck and you're laying there with cannabis on top of you, man, that's a good thing to have, right? That's an assumption of innocence. Also, that this permit on the right-hand side of the screen is from the Florida Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services, DPI, Division of Plant Industry. That's up in Gainesville, they're just off campus, but they were tasked with permitting not only institutions like Florida Gulf Coast, University of Florida, but also growers under the Qualified Project Partner statute. This is the first permit in the state of Florida, so we're very proud of it. See that 001? I mean, that's like getting a first driver's license in 1919 or something in the state of Florida. So that was our first permit. That was our seed storage unit, which is our plant science research and education unit in Marion County, south of what I call the swamp. All right. Yes, question. Good.
I actually grew up in Ocala. Where's that in Marion? Do you know?
It's northern Marion County.
Okay.
So it'd be the Reddick exit.
Oh, okay.
So yeah, what county road is that? 162. And so that's a consolidated research center. That's where most of the campus-based faculty do research. We actually,
kind of middle of nowhere.
yeah, it is. There's some cow-calf and equine. It kind of looks like Marion County, a little bit of hobby horse part of the world. But that's where the hemp was first stored and the hemp trials were conducted. So we immediately permitted different locations. And why would you permit different locations up and down the state? One reason is because everyone thinks Florida is just nothing but sand, but that's not true. There's different types of sand. We have muck around the Everglades. We have rock. We're basically farming rock in the Homestead area. Anyone from Miami-Dade County? Yeah, you basically have coral rock that's been crushed, and we punch holes in and pull out water wherever we want, to irrigate specialty crops. So it's a different world down in Homestead. You get up in Jay, Florida, outside of Pensacola or Quincy, west of Tallahassee, you get in what I call more the Alabama type production, the mid-south, deep south, row crops, cotton, peanuts. Growers up there are kind of interested in fiber, grain production.
What's the soil like up there?
It's heavier. That's a great question. What's the soil like up in the Panhandle? Heavier amounts of sand mixed with clay. So it starts to look more like what you would typically grow row crops on, as you move across that border in Alabama. It's not red clay like Georgia. There's still a fair amount of sand in it. I have a great display on campus that I put together. I hosted a professional meeting, and I have all the soils from all these locations to show people there is diversity. There's also diversity in climate. If you grow up in the Panhandle, you're used to having a winter coat kind of once in a while on you. It's more temperate. But the chill hours, the amount of hours in a winter season that we're below 45 degrees is very minimal once you get to Okeechobee, right? You're getting in that truly subtropical. And then down in Homestead, you're literally tropical, right? If you have a heavy jacket on, of course, you people down there, it could be 65 degrees and you're freezing. You know? That's like a warm day in Maine in Indiana. So you have this climate diversity. And so we permitted all these locations, also some 20 different qualified project partners like C&B Farms, Chuck Ober, for literally 50 different permits up and down the state of Florida. And this is back a couple of years ago now. So we acquired seed, we acquired genetics from China. And why do you think we went looking around the world for genetics? And growers in Kentucky didn't even look too far for genetics. Hopefully you've heard that hemp is a short day plant. Have you had some of the agronomics of cannabis? Commodities like hemp and hops are short day plants, which means it's the length of the night that determines when that plant switches from vegetative growth to flowering. And so therein lies the problem. Much of the genetics historically, rope hemp from 100 years ago, was well adapted from about Kansas, Kentucky on north, Canada. And Canada's been growing hemp for decades now. What happens when you bring those type of hemp genetics down to the state of Florida where we don't hardly get 14 hours a day?
Yeah, it won't flower or grow like in a proper way where they'll.
Exactly. This plant thinks it needs to finish up.
Yeah.
So, and I'm going to show a slide in a few minutes that'll highlight that. It thinks it's time to flower, so it'll grow 8 to 10 inches and start flowering. So you have a non-economic plant that's not putting on enough flower if you're growing for CBD, high cannabinoids, or if you're growing for fiber, it just only gets so high. It doesn't understand the environment it's in. So what we did here, looking at this slide, is we planted both grain fiber and high cannabinoid, like CBD, CBG, the cannabinoids, at different locations, including our North Florida Quincy. This is west of Tallahassee. And you'll see the different type of genetics cultivars. We had cherry blossom, cherry times T1, cherry wine. You got to appreciate breeders in the hemp and marijuana space because they name these different varieties some really cool names, right? It's like, oh, it tastes like cherry wine. Or have you heard of ACDC? That's a dual purpose marijuana. THC, high cannabinoid type cultivar. Really cool names, but I'm not sure it translates to superior performance. But this first year growing high cannabinoid hemp at Quincy was the best year we've seen. And we don't completely understand that. But some of these were big enough you could have put Christmas lights around them. And it would have looked like a tree in the front yard. Really grew well, a lot of flower development. You look at some of the data here, and I don't know how well you can see these graphs. When you look at total potential THC, what alarms you when you see that upper left graph? You've got total THC on the y-axis, weeks after flowering initiation and thesis on the x-axis. 3.5, 4 weeks after flowering initiated, every one of those cultivars became illegal. They went hot. And so is that genetics? Is it the environment? This was concerning. On the up note, look at the lower left graph, y-axis cannabinoid percentage, weeks after initiation of flowering. Look at some of the expression of cannabinoids like CBD and CBG. Growers like Chuck Ober will tell you if you can get 11, 12% expression, you can begin to make money on the cannabinoid market. That's hard to achieve that. The problem is by the time we got there, DEA says you have a hot field and you can't sell any of that flower material. So we knew we had a problem, and we knew we had a problem too at the timing of when these plants needed to be planted, so they didn't flower too early in their development. We also had some day neutral genetics, and there's some different biotypes of cannabis that express more of a day neutral, kind of like a corn plant, where the plant is not so dependent on the photo period. The problem we saw with those is the lack of yield. Look at the graphs there. So that's just a quick sampling. I am struggling with a long-standing cough. I'm not COVID positive. I think I mentioned that. So let's talk about the photo period again. Yeah,
I actually had a quick question. Back in the last slide, I believe it was CBD, like on the bottom left graph.
okay.
Why does it like week 10 to 14, why does the content decrease?
That's a great question. What you're talking about there, and we ran these plants to natural senescence.
Okay.
So senescence is the end of the plant
Yeah.
life, like letting the corn plant dry down before you combine it. And so you're gonna have flower degradation and quality loss.
Just from sunlight.
So you reach a peak and then the quality is gonna go down, you know, bugs and critters are gonna start.
So you guys weren't harvesting them like at.
We were, yeah, and that's where the data points are. We were taking subsamples, but we were also continuing. And we do that with strawberry research and a number of other commodities, because we're looking at yield over a season. Whereas, excuse me, whereas the grower's looking at yield when he or she can make money on the market. So if you're a producer, South Florida, you're gonna try to hit that 4.5 weeks after initiation of flowering. And you really have to time it, because you have to have maximum expression while you're still legal. Because the 2018 Farm Bill, President Trump signed, said hemp is an agricultural commodity. The reality is it is, but it's still a-regulated. You can buy a bag of seed corn or peanuts, plant it, but you can't go out and buy a bag of hemp seed without having an approved license or permit in the state you're growing in. There is no state in our country. And 49 of the 50 states have their own hemp permitting process. And I don't know, does anyone know? That's a great trivia question. One state decided, and if you don't have it, that one state, it goes to the federal rules. Just a little fun there. Great question, no. So the Gulf Coast Research and Education Center is located in Hillsborough County in the heart of strawberry growing region. Anyone go to the Strawberry Festival? That's a great annual event. Yeah, there you go, native Floridian. They do a lot of great research. That center was built in 2005. But one thing they did was interesting. They have a hop yard. If you like beer, and I'm speaking to the 21 and over crowd here, hops are an integral part of beer making, one of the 4 main ingredients. But hops are related to hemp. In fact, in a lab setting, you can graft cannabis to hops, and that plant will grow. So they're genetically similar, but they're also short dated. So we're taking hop cultivars from Montana, Washington State, bringing them to Florida. How do you think we get them to grow? We put supplemental lighting on top of the hop yard at Gulf Coast. And we can get 2 crops of hops per year. And you can get some of that beer, purchase that beer with Florida grown hops at breweries like Three Daughters, is there, in St. Pete? There's a few smaller family breweries. And it's really neat research. You see the lights at night? You don't need a lot of artificial lighting intensity. You just have to have that minimum amount that cannabis or hops understands that they're still daily. So what we did is we used part of the hop yard. You can see these poles because hops, it's a climbing vine. And we planted at the same time, the same genetics, cherry blossom times team 1, under supplemental lighting and under natural lighting about 500 feet down the field. This is like 60 days after transplanting. These were actually clones off of mother plants. Look at the growth where you had supplemental lighting. Really good looking. This is going to yield some flower for the high cannabinoid market. What do you got here? This is what we talked about. You got a 12-inch plant to flower because it thought it was time to flower. So what's the take-home message here? We have to understand that our environment is different from much of the rest of the United States. And like with so many crops, including blueberries, strawberries, that we have great industries in this state with commodities like this. If we're going to have an emerging and sustainable grain fiber or cannabinoid market outdoors, we're going to have to breed our way there through plant breeding efforts. And that's ongoing, not so much at the University of Florida, but it's not a basement activity like it was in the 70s with high THC cannabis. There are institutions and private entities that are trying to breed more adapted, high yielding low THC cannabis. So I just love that hop here. If you ever get a chance to see that, that's pretty cool. So my son played college baseball, and so I like to give this analogy, and this is kind of my take-home message in the middle of the presentation. So if you're going to work in a greenhouse setting, if you're going to stake out in your own controlled environment agriculture, try to grow cannabis. It's too expensive to grow cannabis unless you work for someone on the medical marijuana side of the state of Florida. I think there's only 20 permits in the whole state licenses. But anyone can get a license that has an operation, agricultural, in the state of Florida. You know what the cost of a license is in the state?
Over $1 million, right?
On the medical marijuana side, it's millions of dollars, and it's a waiting list. But to grow hemp, it's free. You just have to have a hemp plan put together and submit that to AFTAX, which is our State Department of Agriculture. So back to the issue of tools. So when my son was recruited to play college baseball, and they do this in other sports, they look for 5 tools in baseball, whether they're going to play the major league level or college like Florida Gulf Coast. Speed, power, hitting for average, arm strength, and fielding. And my son was lucky enough to have a good 3 or 4 of them. He does have Tommy John's now, which is unfortunate. If you're a left-handed kid, and fun fact in my family, my wife and I are both right-handed, and we raised 3 left-handed kids, which is really, it gets to be difficult because you have to buy more expensive sports stuff, and then you try to teach him stuff when you're showing your right hand. So that was kind of unusual, but his left hand probably got him to college, so that was good. On the hemp side, seeking adapted hemp, growers should look for at least 5 tools. Okay, why risk the money growing a particular cultivar if it has propensity, the probability of going hot? Because you cannot sell hot flower material or even fiber material, which is something that really we need to figure out, maybe separate those rules going forward. Seed, plant, vigor, and viability. Here's a take-home message from back in 2019. We spent thousands of dollars just buying little 30-pound bags, 50-pound bags of seed from China, seed from Europe, seed from Canada. And this wouldn't happen in the corn and soybean industry. Less than half that seed would come up, was viable. And so the seed laws didn't apply, or you weren't able to get any recourse because there wasn't enough seed. So there is a lack of uniformity of approved high-performing genetics out there still to this day, this very day. So that needs to improve. You need to really do your homework if you're going to invest in mother plants for the cannabinoid market or seed for the grain fiber. Day length, photo period appropriate. And this can be manipulated. We were able to grow really good up in Tallahassee, that area, really good high cannabinoid hemp, but we had to time our planting to May, June, because the longest day length in Florida and Indiana is on June 21st, right? And so from then on, it starts to creep down. So you got to time it. You got to do your homework. Pest resistance. I've heard it joked about that Florida is the land of plagues and pestilence, and we have a lot of issues, and that's one reason historically why we have 12 research and education centers, because we got critters down in your county and this part of the world that we don't have up in Panhandle. And so we're working on pest issues with sugarcane in the Everglades agricultural area, but we're also working with cotton pests up in the Panhandle. And so cannabis is not unlike any other commodity. There are a number of things that want to eat it, chew it up. We even found out, and this is a strange fact, that fire ants don't bother most crops. But I don't know if they're looking for a cheap high or what, but fire ants are damaging hemp in the field. They're crawling up the plant. And so we've had to figure out ways to mitigate that, which is something, you don't have an issue with that in Tennessee or North Carolina. So it's the beauty of living in the state of Florida. So, and yield, growers are in business to make money. They want to do it in an economically and environmentally sustainable way, but they're not in it for a hobby, the larger growers. So yield has to be focused on, has to be important, whether it's flower material, grain, or fiber. We're doing time. So we had this 2-year pilot project. We had 2 years of field trials. But what happened in 2020? we had this kind of worldwide situation called COVID, and it shut down a lot of research and a lot of extension programming. I was literally sleeping in my university truck, still moving not only plant material around. We were given approval to keep going because we were on the clock. I was delivering masks and plants at the same time around the state. But the happy takeaway I had from 2020, as bad as it was, and most of you were in high school, right? Was it was so cool to drive down I-75 that there was no traffic. There was no traffic because everything had shut down, at least early on. But we did have 2 years to get a lot of this work done. So what did we learn? Well, the second year we got more aggressive with on-farm trials, and we worked with wonderful growers like Tater Farms, which is Ancient City Hemp, St. Augustine, and a number of other growers. And what we learned coming out of 2020, 2021 is that many of the varieties we've looked at still exceed the total THC threshold. There are some promising genetics, but data planning and how you manage it are critically important. Timing. When you drop those plants in the ground in Homestead, when you drop them in the ground west of Tallahassee. Much like any other commodity grown state, there's environmental and biotic challenges. Whether it's southern leaf blight, whether it's fire ants, downy mildew, powdery mildew, it's probably more substantial. Fungal diseases. On-farm trials, and we had seeded funding, which is our internal research funding, and we got state legislative funding also. Led to us getting information on the street, the family farms, growers, ranches across the state, but we still got to learn a heck of a lot more. So I've been talking about the growth side and genetics, but the great thing about a land-grant institution the size of the University of Florida is we have a law school, medical school, and just a number of schools, journalism. So we partnered with the medical school of pharmacology, and they took our extract from the hemp material, plant material, and they started looking at possible positive effects on brain tumors in humans. And they're seeing some positive results, and we're getting publications in the literature. And this is a feel-good moment really for us at IFAS because we're advancing science not only on the agronomic and horticultural level, but we have fantastic researchers in the medical school that are looking at how natural products like cannabinoids, terpenes, which is part of that flower material, might have a positive effect on human diseases. So much more to learn there. So where are we going with research now? Well, and if you've had bankers, you've had some people in the industry talk about the hype and then how everything kind of crashed, the isolate price dropped. Where are we going now in the state? Well, much of the funding we're getting, our scientists like Dr. Grimm, is for nutrient management research efforts to better understand how many pounds of a particular nutrient you're going to put on a crop of cannabis, whether it's on the flower grow and raised beds or in a field in a drilled like biomass type production. This is a requirement based on long-standing statute and regulation in the state of Florida. If you're going to grow a commodity for sale as a grower, as a rancher, you have to adhere to BMPs, and BMPs are best management practices. The only other option is you develop your own, and you don't want to go down that road specifically. So we don't have established BMPs for a commodity that was illegal up until 2017. So this past year in the state legislature in Tallahassee, they funded $8.7 million plus, specifically to IFAS, for us to conduct a study highlighted there in yellow to examine the appropriate rates of fertilizer on tomatoes, potatoes, citrus, corn, green beans, and any other crop identified by IFAS. And one of those crops we identified was hemp, because FDACS, our State Department of Agriculture, wants us to fine tune and get some updated BMPs on the street. So, and I love this picture here because this is like a marketing, right? If you only put no pounds of nitrogen, you get this little plant. But if you put 200 pounds of nitrogen per acre, you get this big plant. So, kind of neat. So 517,000 of that $8 million was specifically for BMP work in hemp, and that's ongoing, both at the Citra location in Marion County, in the Panhandle, and down at Homestead, Miami-Dade County. So how do we communicate these findings? During COVID, we did it through virtual workshops. We do it through our marketing specialists in our various departments, IFAS communications. And we have a statewide extension team. So extension is one of those three arms of the land grant institution. We have extension agents. We have 4-H agents. Anyone a 4-H? Oh, you usually see one. You're a 4-H. We got one raised here. So there's typically a 4-H educator agent in every county, and that's most states across the country. But on the agriculture side, many agents jumped at the chance to be on the team to help get this early information out. One interesting thing about this legislation back in 2018 from the state legislature is they saw that it was the Wild West. People were selling seed that was inferior. We had no idea what the performance was going to be. And they said, the legislators, to sell seed and mother plants in the state of Florida, clones, and everyone know what a clone is? The cutting. It's from a mother plant. So you stick them in a tray and they root. And that's on the high cannabinoid side. It needs to be approved by an official certifying agency or pilot project approved, which is really strange because that kind of puts pressure on us. And we were pressured. And we, again, delivered by developing a 12-week grow process, partnered with Roseville Farms here at Popka, north of Disney World, that part of the world, to bring in genetics from growers all around the country that want to get approved to sell their clones for cannabinoid production in the state of Florida. So we got to define our own rules. How are we going to do this? We decided to do it in a controlled growth environment. That way it was apples to apples, same photo period. You stick them, go 3 weeks under 18 hours. 18 hours keeps it vegetative, right? No flowering. Then 5 more weeks in a separate room gets more vegetative growth. And then we drop the lights to 10 hours. We figure at the 10-hour photo period, most every cultivar should switch to flower. And that's essentially what happened. So again, apples to apples, we monitored everything, light intensity, temperature, humidity, those type of environmental parameters. At the end of the 12 weeks, if there was significant biomass production and the top 8 inches of the plant was taken and sent to a lab, in this case ACS Labs, which I think is in the Tampa area. And if that total, you see this arrow, that total THC came back below 0.3% THC by dry weight, they were given a certificate. In addition to this certificate, they were given a certificate to sell in the state of Florida. And we did approve 21 cultivars, but we paused the program at the end of 2021. Do you know why we would do that? No one was sending us any entries. You know, the market had essentially stagnated, if not crashed, because of the oversupply of isolate. So what is the future of hemp in the state of Florida? I think that's going to depend on investment. And maybe the bankers and lawyers talked about that. You know, it's a market where there's some legalities to still work through. State banks can lend, but federal banks get nervous. And the lack of entrepreneurial investment in fiber processing and scientific advances on the processing end are probably keeping the fiber industry at bay right now in the United States. Most of the fiber grown in the world is coming from China. And all you have to do is turn on CNN and Fox News nowadays to see that there is a lot of pressure to move some of our staple production and pharmaceuticals and other products away from Chinese type production. So maybe it's your generation that latches onto this idea of a green industry, not only with cannabis, low THC, but other biomass type crops. Because I was told in the 1970s we were going to run out of fossil fuel by the time I was 35 years old, and I'm still filling up my university pickup trucks. So, you know, but what are we doing? We're fracking, we're going elsewhere. You know, Are we on borrowed time? Yeah. You all are young enough that, will you be driving electric cars 20 years from now, or will you be driving like my 2001 Jeep? I think more of you will be driving electric cars. How do you get there? So again, it's going to take investment. There is promising technologies emerging on the fiber side, hempcrete for building products, but you got to get standardized type products people will believe in and contractors will be willing to build. Where's my Marion County person here? Yeah, he's in the corner, right? Greens Reserve is a good example of a lobbyist that's entrepreneurial, that he started it's like a tobacco snuff. I don't know if any of you chew tobacco. But this is hemp snuff, and it's legal. And a lot of that is grown and put together in Ocala, Florida. And you have to be 21, so if you're on that website, or 18, what is it? 18.
21.
But I wanted to highlight that besides these generic products like beer and pharmaceuticals, and what is it, hemp mustard? I don't know what that is. Yeah, hemp lotion, there you go. But there are entrepreneurial type people like Jeff Green that are looking to put out new and unique products that are green economy based. And you avoid all the tobacco taxes and nicotine, because this is hemp, this is flower material. So here's my summary. We're still looking for better and adapted hemp genetics, and you could insert anything into that name hemp, because for us to grow crops in the state of Florida, we are rather unique. And so if hemp is going to flourish as an industry emerge, University of Florida is probably going to be involved in that emergence through our breeding efforts. Weeds, diseases, insects are an issue. We have extension publications on that, so you can look. We're getting funding now on the LBR side and from State Department of Agriculture. That OAWP is the Office of Ag Water Policy. So they are concerned about BMPs and efficient use of nutrients, because we have sandy soils in Florida. We move a lot of water around in this great state. We got to do it in a way that doesn't threaten our waterways when we're applying nutrients. Our take home on our side, and we feel good about this, we led an effort to provide an open and credible process for the verification of hemp cultivars, all no crop yields. Of course, it's on hold now, but you can always ramp that back up if needed. If you want to see the whole of what we did over 2 years, that 2-year report to Governor DeSantis is on our hemp website. All I got to do is Google UF hemp. Yeah. At one time, we were getting 50,000 hits a month on that website. It was the most popular site at the university for a couple months running. But you know what trumped it all is, I don't know if you saw the article when University of Florida researchers got to grow plants on the moon soil. Do you remember that? Yeah. That was like 1.8 million hits in a week or something, because it's moon soil. So we got blown out of the water there. So I believe that's my last slide. I wanted to leave time for questions. Hemp, cannabis, peppermint. I love mint. I was supposed to bring some trivia. My wife gave me peppermint to give you, peppermint patties. I was supposed to ask questions and I forgot. But Indiana is number 4 in mint production. So every stick of gum you chew probably has oil from Washington State in it, oil from Northern Indiana, because they mix it together to get that just like Wrigley's taste. So, little trivia. Any questions? Yes.
So if you're gonna make like textiles or something, or like the hempcrete, if your production goes over that 0.35%, you have to toss every plant, or?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So what is the point of the testing? Where is it? It's at the point of 30 days before harvest. And so the growers that are trying to stay in compliance, you have a 30-day window. So they're sampling on that first day and they're harvesting on day 29 because they're still legal. They got their certificate of analysis. But if it is still hot, they don't have to sample when they actually harvest, just within 30 days. They're okay, but if that's 0.33 or 0.38, they can't sell them. Now, in a perfect world where state departments of agriculture get along with federal legislators, would it make sense that we have a 1% THC for fiber hemp? and 0.3% for cannabinoids, to me, that makes a lot of sense. Because you're not gonna eat your coke,
Yeah.
right? You're not gonna eat your sugar. So why are we so concerned? And you can't smoke enough fiber hemp at 1% to get high. You'd have to smoke 20 acres at once. You can't do that. So, because most marijuana is 10 to 24%, right, or above. So we're just talking about people that just don't understand the crop, the plant.
How often then, it's like how, like close of a threshold is that for plants? Like, is it really easy to bump over that 0.35%?
It is, and you saw that graph earlier in my presentation, so you're dealing with time after the initiation of flowering. Now, on the fiber side, I think we're gonna get there much sooner because you don't have a lot of flowers. You know, it's a dioecious plant. You got female plants, male plants. And so typically when you harvest for fiber, it's right when they start to flower. You're not letting it get to where it's like a cotton plant, you know, where it's pretty much
let
done growing.
them, I'm not like a botanist or anything, but couldn't you let them fertilize each other? Because doesn't the seed production cut out a lot of the THC production?
It does. Yeah, if you want to ruin a field of CBD plants, you know, have a male plant at the end of the field, right? Males are useless when it comes to cannabinoid production, right? All those plants you see in plasticulture, in a greenhouse, in the field, for high cannabinoids, hemp is female. That's why you have female mother plants. And it's an amazing plant because we had female mother plants that look like trees. And it'll literally get a woody stem. And any of you been up close to cannabis and a CBD, CBG type production system, those mother plants can get pretty woody and big. And that's where you're getting your mother material. My son works for Liberty Health Sciences. So I'm on the hemp side, my son works on the medical marijuana side. And he works in vegetation. This is in North Florida, up near Stark, Florida, near I-10. And, you know, what they're trying to do is have those plants fully developed, and then they have a separate mother plant area that they have to keep bringing in new mother plants to keep the health up. And that takes a tremendous amount of work to manage that in a disease, high growth environment. The good news for them is they don't have to worry about what the percent THC is. So he doesn't have that issue where I have our researchers and we have that issue. That's why we carry the federal registration, because the state has determined we can run hot in our research trials because we were growing marijuana in our pilot project. And we were running upwards of 0.7, 1%. Some of those Chinese genetics were 1%. Of course, China doesn't care. They're just growing fiber. They don't have rules like we do. So.
What do you do with that when you are growing marijuana, like and it's too hot? Like
When it's hot? Yeah, so that's a great question. What do we do when it goes hot?
Do you throw it away?
Yeah, everything we do in our project is crop destroy. So we're autoclaving it if we're in a greenhouse setting, you know, on campus. Or what we do is we'll run a disc back and forth in the field, you know, and render it useless. Again, you're not going to go out there on a Friday night with your fraternity brothers and grab, you know, 1% plants because it's just not worth it. Yes, I'll get you next.
Is there a difference in the quality of the fiber that you get from a product that runs at a lower percentage THC, or is it the exact same quality?
So the quality question based on THC, that's a great question. I don't think so, but that's something I have to look at the literature because most of the fiber production, that's what you're talking about, right? Most of that's being harvested right when it starts flowering. And those are the male pollen and the female flowers on fiber hemp, they're not very large. And so, and you're not really growing that plant beyond the beginning of that thesis flowering. So I don't think it plays a lot into that. I think there's more genetic differences in that fiber because manufacturers want a certain type of stem, fast and herd, you know, percent, all that. I'm gonna get your question.
Do you guys have to deal with a lot of hermaphrodites or any weird?
That's a great question. The hermaphrodites. This is an amazing plant because we grew some plants at Gulf Coast Research and Education Center. And you saw that with the hop yard. And halfway through that study, some of those plants were changing sexes. They were female plants, and all of a sudden they're sending up male antlers. Yeah, and so what the heck is going on, right? And that's very concerning if you're investing a lot of money, $25,000, $30,000 an acre, high cannabinoid production. It does happen. It shows that we don't have these genetics tightened up yet. There's still breakout type events.
I was gonna ask, like, are you guys using auto flowering plants or are they just like regular?
We still are looking at auto flowering.
Okay, so that's,
Kyogene is a company based out of California that's provided us year after year with genetics. But it's a dwarf. When you get into auto flowering, you get into dwarf plants. So it's higher number per acre.
so is it 90-day growth cycle? Is that what you guys aimed for?
So the growth cycle, I'd say at the field level, you're talking, 70 to 90 days.
Yeah.
But we have not seen where the dwarfs type genetics that are available can compete with a greenhouse high production system or a well-managed field system. But again, we're so early into this, we don't have all the answers. I think it's going to take significant breeding efforts and a market to support it because the money dried up. By the time Florida Gulf Coast would have got into it, and I think you all were looking at it a couple of years ago, we were having people that were ready to write checks just walk away. Now, some of that was COVID too, because everyone got nervous when COVID hit. But the market became oversupplied. We'd have to feed every pet with CBD and half of you all in the country to have a demand for CBD that would require, a number of states to produce one. So they tell me pets really benefit from CBD. Okay.
We've got about 10 minutes.
If you have any questions, my email is all over the internet. Look up that 2-year report if you're interested. We're still working with this. If you really want to work in this space, it's an amazing plan. It really is. And it's just a bias, political or otherwise, that probably